Welcome to our sixth in a series of video time capsules commemorating the 75th anniversary of the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I'm Eric Wheeler, today's moderator. Today is Thursday, May 14th, 1992. We're going to talk about the past, present, and future of this university, addressing the theme of the 75th observance, which is yesterday, today, and tomorrow. First of all, I'd like to introduce our panelists. Starting on the left, Dr. Henry Lippold.
Just Mr. Eric will do.
Okay, well, we'll start off on an informal note. Mr. Lippold is a professor of journalism in the journalism department. He's also involved with the honors program. Mr. Lippold has been associated with broadcasting since 1947 when he started radio work in Oshkosh. Henry has been here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire since 1972. Dr. Margaret Cassidy is an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology. Dr. Cassidy teaches family sociology, sociology of gender, and social gerontology. Margaret Cassidy has been here at UW-Eau Claire since 1982. And next, Dr. Carol Fairbanks, who is a professor in the English department. She has taught at UW-EC since 1971. Carol was the first UW-EC Women's Studies coordinator, and Dr. Fairbanks has published several works, including works on African American writers, Prairie women writers, and Japanese women writers as well. And Dr. Thomas King has joined us as well this afternoon. Dr. King is an assistant professor in the Department of Communications Disorders. Dr. King is a speech and language pathologist specializing in areas of voice disorders and argumentative and alternative communications. Is it augmentative? Pardon me. It is augmentative and alternative communications. Okay. Welcome to all of you this afternoon. Looking forward to an hour of lively conversation about the past, present, and future of the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. I'd like to start off giving each of you a chance to reflect on your concept, your feelings about the campus culture here at the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire. Perhaps looking back to what you felt the atmosphere was on campus when you arrived here, how it has changed over the years, or maybe it hasn't changed. And also I'd like you to reflect on what you feel are some of the particular strengths here at UW-Eau Claire, and also maybe some areas in which things could be improved. I'd like to start off this afternoon with Mr. Henry Lippold, if you would.
Thank you, Eric. Too bad for the rest of you, because I can handle the hour on that platter. Actually, when I came here, there still was some ferment alive in the land. It was at the lessening of the Vietnam War demonstrations and so on, but there still was feeling here, and there were a few demonstrations when I arrived. Also, the American Indian movement was quite active at that time. So the Blue Gold Room in the Davies Center would be alive with people late at night, unlike what it is most of the time. People discussing serious social, political issues. Now, to jump forward 20 years from 1972, it seems to me that the culture among the students is one of concern, worry. They're very deeply concerned about the economy and what's going to become of them. There didn't seem to be, well, there obviously wasn't that much concern in 1972 because people devoted a great deal of time to non-professional, non-employment, even scholarly activities because they were concerned about what was going on in the world. But now I think the students are really bearing down on thoughts about their futures. It was interesting to come here from the University of Illinois. The quality of students, I felt, was just as good. Our students could hold their own anywhere. The only difference was, and this is a problem that we've all had to grapple with over the years, is that the homogeneity is quite a bit different. Not only racial, because we would like more racial diversity and cultural diversity, but geographical diversity would be interesting. I mean, I've been here now 20 years. I've never met a person from Brooklyn or California, a student. So that'd be one thing that would be nice to get. But as far as quality, intellectual capability, capacity, I think our students could hold their own. Well, I could go on and on, Eric, but let's hear from...
And you will.
Yeah, let's hear from Margaret.
Fine, thank you. Margaret.
Thanks. I came here in 1982, so I've been here about 10 years, and it's interesting because had also thought about homogeneity among the students, and that has certainly been a striking feature, I think, of UW-Eau Claire, although we've seen a little bit more diversity in the last few years, but still a very, very small proportion, cultural, racial, etc. And I also was struck by the geographic lack of difference, I guess. Most people from Minnesota and Wisconsin and all that sort of thing. And also I think it's interesting because the students I talk with oftentimes want to stay in this area. It's not even just a matter of being drawn here and then thinking about going far-flung places. It's more staying here. And so I thought that was rather intriguing. As far as the campus climate with faculty, I've found, particularly within my own department, a lot of friendliness and acceptance and openness. And I have gotten to know, I think, quite a few people around the campus just through various committees and that sort of thing. And I think most people have been very, very friendly. I think the students are friendly as well. Respectful typically, but friendly. In terms of the classroom climate, I find in general the students are oftentimes a little bit reticent to engage in much discussion, at least frequently, but sometimes you can get people going, and I think it's not that people don't have things to say, it's just perhaps back to, I think, the respect they have for the faculty, and they're not sure what their role is supposed to be and that sort of thing. But in general, I've had real positive experiences with the students here and with other faculty.
As both Henry and Margaret, I think, have intimated, our student body and to some degree our faculty has been somewhat conservative. But what has intrigued me is that there has always been a voice for those who do have the energy and commitment to pursue other perspectives. And I think a wonderful example, a story that I've heard told quite frequently over the last 20 years, is the situation in 1969 when I was here as a master's student, and students were actively concerned about environmental issues, about the war, about racism. And they protested, they organized, and they marched on Chancellor Haas's house. And Mrs. Haas invited them in for cookies and Coke. And they sat down and had a very serious but warm-hearted discussion of the issues, and everyone went home. And over the years, I think that has served as sort of a model for some of the things that other universities have become very confrontational issues. Some wounds have been opened, and our administration has been able to give faculty and students, and I say give because not all universities manage that, have been able to give voice to faculty and students, and without the distress and the tension that has sometimes accompanied differences.
Thank you. Tom?
My first time on campus as a faculty person was in 1988. I came in August of 88. And because I'm a member of the communication disorders faculty, we live in the Exile campus there, the North campus across the river. In fact, I think we're really UW Superior, I've heard. But I'm in the Exile campus there in Allied Health and also with fine arts across the river. So my view is perhaps even a little different from people who are on this side of the river. I would agree with all of the panelists about the homogeneity. One of the interesting things about our department, we have an undergraduate program and graduate in communication disorders, and we're one of the few master's level programs in the area, meaning this region of the country. So we attract quite a few Canadian students. So probably the greatest diversity that we get, and being partially Canadian in background myself, are the students from Thunder Bay or from Winnipeg or from Edmonton or out that direction. And unfortunately, that probably is the greatest diversity we get, although there is a little bit of diversity there. My first contact with UW-Eau Claire, interestingly enough, was I was a student at UW-Madison, and I went there as a National Merit Scholar and so forth, and majored in communication disorders. And when I was about to go on for the graduate school time, I got an identical USOE fellowship there as I did at Eau Claire, and I had found out about Eau Claire because one time, about 1971 or so, it must have been just before you got here and probably just after you got here, I was coming up this way. We own some family land up north near Superior, where I kind of called home, and was coming through to that, so I stopped by Eau Claire, and at that time my hair was quite long, and I drove the VW bus and all of the obligatory 60-ish, early 70 accoutrements.
The things we wanted to.
And as I came through the UW-Eau Claire campus, when I'd never really been here very much before, but I saw this big crowd of people gathered basically right out where we are here, and they had tents and tables set up, and apparently what had happened is they had organized an alternative food service, as I read it. It was their co-op or their communal food service to protest or to at least give an alternative to what the university was doing. And I thought, hey, this looks just like Mifflin Street, or this looks just like Madison. This is what I'm used to. And I ended up meeting some people, in fact became fairly good friends with some of the folks that I met there, and still keep touch with them 20 years later. But that's what kind of piqued my interest about Eau Claire, and then I did come here as a master's level student and got a master's in communication disorders from here, and then obviously have gone on other places since. But I guess my association also began in 1972, when it was much more perhaps outspoken, radicalized. I find that among our students in our particular building, and believe me, we really get kind of trapped in our own little world over there. Probably a lot of it is my own fault or our own fault, but some of it is also logistics, and I think the students kind of have the same experience. Number one of the big differences between 1972 and now is that they're all female now. At the time when I was early here, it was roughly half and half, male and female. So literally every student that I speak to in the year, very likely, is going to be female. They're going to be from probably about a 50-mile radius, although we do have a lot of Twin Cities students. And then the only diversity that at least we've seen included on a regular basis would be the Canadian students.
No minority.
None at all. We did have a very fine student from Cyprus who had come and got an undergrad major, and now she's gone on into a graduate program at Purdue. But that's about as close as we've gotten to a minority, and she was Greek or Cypriot, so I'm not just sure how you would call that. But we have very, very nice students, very attentive, very respectful, as you've mentioned. Perhaps maybe not as eager to move outside the norm or the usual kind of track that students like to follow. When the first year I was here in the symposium, the speaker talked about the bargain. Remember that one? It was the fall of '88, and he said that the bargain, basically, that's sort of implied between us and the students is that, or among us and the students, whatever, is that we present the information, they memorize and write down the information, and then we test them on it, and if they answer at X percentage, that's sort of the implicit bargain of how university education is done. And sometimes I'm concerned that we don't move beyond the bargain in our teaching. But surely we have a very fine, very respectful, very bright group in general, and it's never difficult working with them.
Tom, you put your finger on something there, this kind of faculty isolation. We just don't come together very often. I think that's been a historic thing all the time I've been here.
Oh, literally in this school year now, 1991-92, this is, I think, probably the third time I've been across the river during a work day. On weekends or something I may be over here, but as part of my regular work day, I just can't get out of the office with students and with clinic and with classes and so forth. I'm there from 8 till 6 every day, easy, and I just don't have time to hike across the bridge, and many days don't care to when the wind is blowing. That's another cultural factor, too, that we should know about. Even Johnny Carson apparently mentioned the wind on the bridge at some point on his show.
But that is bad, because we miss the intellectual sharing and comparing.
When
It's get more inbred into your own
every
line
year
of work, as it were.
in the fall, I'm sorry, go
No,
ahead.
I was going to say, I think part of that, though, comes from graduate school and the emphasis on specialization. You know, I know when I came here, I mean, I was in a building with almost only sociologists for graduate school. And of course, there are other people on my floor. We share the building with business, and that's been an interesting phenomenon, the sociologists and the business people, and we, go back and forth on some things sometimes, but those are the main people I've had contact with outside of, as I say, committee work or whatever. But I think part of what happens is, even though we talk about the university as a learning community and as a place ideally to share ideas, it's very difficult both because of time constraints, geographic constraints, whether you're across the river or just in your own building, but also specialization, that being such a strong emphasis for us. So we're speaking different languages, I think, sometimes. Have different agendas or whatever, too, so.
Yeah, exactly.
I've heard many of the same themes and comments from four of you as I've heard from others, and I think they do reflect some of the attributes that UW-Eau Claire is known for, and that is that it does value excellence, that it does tend to draw from a fairly defined geographic area. There tends to be a homogeneity in terms of ethnic, racial, and social background. And there tends to be a feeling that Eau Claire is somewhat isolated from some of the more nagging and unpleasant problems that we're facing as a society. Is that perhaps isn't all bad? Would you, or should Eau Claire more directly reflect society as a whole? Should we become more of a microcosm and try to face up to and confront some of these main issues? Do you think as the university continues on into the 21st century, should Eau Claire maybe take a more defined role, a clearer leadership role in dealing with social and political issues that perhaps many of us have been willing to say, well, that's a problem in Madison, or that's a problem in the larger inner cities, or that's a problem on the other side of the world? I guess what I'm saying is there's two different ways to look at it. We have very much been a thriving institution as in our own little part of the world here, in this beautiful part of the world, and we have, as Henry had pointed out, attracted quality students. Should that mission somehow change? Should we be more aggressive in confronting some of these key issues that are in the headlines every day? Should Eau Claire perhaps be taking a leading role in perhaps attracting people that would more accurately reflect the broad spectrum of our population? Anyone want to tackle that?
Well, I'm not sure on that. Again, I guess I've kind of lived through and seen both sides of it, having been in the Madison campus there during the late 60s and early 70s. To some extent, the isolation or the security that we have here allows you to maybe get on with what you would really rather be doing in some respects. Certainly in the clinical field where we do have patients to treat and so forth, there's that aspect that only gets set back or disrupted if you have other interruptions. On the other hand, I'm very concerned for our communication disorders students that from about the sophomore year on, we kind of put them in the pipeline and just shoot them down, and they don't really get to think about, at least in a formal way, anything other than ComDis. So I think that a certain amount of community or university agitation or awareness would be good as part of their liberal arts education. Communication obviously extends through everything that human beings do, and even if it's disordered communication, still it's done by human beings. So I think there's probably a learning aspect there. And yet again, when I think of all the disruption and the tear gassing and everything that I went through as a student when I was attempting to learn, I'm not sure if I would want to redo that. It got to be pretty wild for a while there with the guard and the police and everything in Madison, and that's part of the reason I opted to come here back in the late 60s, early 70s. So.
Well, I would say ditto to some of what Tom said. I mean, at the University of Illinois, we had all the ferment that you could want. I was there throughout the 60s and into the early 70s. Yeah. And they had Champaign-Urbana were different, though. You had a kind of living laboratory. They were tightly segregated cities, so the racial issue was real and dynamic right there. The anti-war, anti-draft, civil rights, and the fourth movement also, which we have not mentioned, was the student liberation movement. I get such a kick out of these students coming home from Water Street at 2 o'clock in the morning. They think that just happened, that's the natural order of things. I mean, and women especially come walking home from Water Street at that hour of the morning. That'd be impossible in 1972. The Dean of Women would not let them out past 10. You weren't going to go to the dormitory and mixed floors and all that. It's just like many of these young people don't know the history, and that was won through hard work, and some of you probably participated in that movement. So we can't have the living laboratory, but being a liberal arts-oriented kind of school, we certainly should be on top of it and including it in anything that we do.
Yeah, I was just thinking too about that maybe it's not so much the total campus fervency that would be from the 60s and 70s, given that you're, I think, making the point that in some ways, and maybe that was distracting to try and get other things done, but there's so many very important issues, social issues, that even if they're not seemingly directly touching us here, they are in so many ways. They're affecting our whole society. And how many of these students are going to be in places where they experience those things, and how well can they deal with that? And I mean, I think part of it may be an intellectual kind of concern and attempt to understand, maybe not an experiential, but it's a part of our society. And if our society is having problems, at some point it's going to affect us even more directly. I mean, we feel insulated here, but we're not totally insulated. I mean, look at the unemployment problem here. Look at the Uniroyal going out of business and all that kind of stuff. And what are those people going to do? So in some ways it's touched us, but in other ways it hasn't as much. But I think we still have a responsibility to have students be aware.
I think another thing that's going to happen is more and more parents are going to advise students to come to Eau Claire because we are safe. It is a non-threatening situation. And in fact, a couple of years ago, Eau Claire was listed in the newspaper as being one of the safest cities in the country. And on one hand, I'm proud of that. I tell my Japanese friends, send your children here. We aren't New York. Yeah. And yet, that's going to create an artificial setting in which our students live for 4 or 5 or 6 years. And as you've all been saying, they aren't going to really understand what's going on outside, even though we teach African American lit and women in cross-cultural perspective and all of those things. It's going to be an intellectual experience and problem.
Well, I guess, again, from the viewpoint of someone who works with disability a lot, all of what we see with disability rights, with programs for disabled and public policy, anything that any professional and or disabled person lives with is certainly a network of public policy, and all of that has basically come out of the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. The Americans with Disabilities Act that was just signed into law last year is going to have sweeping major impact on disabled people in the workplace, and of course remember that could be you or me in a moment here too. It isn't just them, it could be us. And so I think, and I kind of feel bad at times that our students learn about how to treat disability or regard disability, but without realizing that it rests on a whole framework, just like you were saying, of achievement and of growth that has had to occur. The fact that there are handicapped switches on the bathrooms in our building, or the fact that there are flat ramps going into the doors and so forth, that didn't just happen. A building even 5 or 10 years ago being built may not have had that type of accommodation, let alone program adaptation. So yeah, it is all kind of intermixed. Our society has surely changed a lot. One of the things that I still remember from Madison, and even here when I was a student here in 1972, was smoking. Everyone smoked in the classroom. I remember I remember the instructors smoking in the classroom. I had one guy who would be smoking and put his cigarette in the chalk tray, and then he'd go to reach for the chalk, and occasionally he'd miss the chalk and get his cigarette. And but of course, when you tell students about that now, it just, oh no, that couldn't have been. You couldn't, but absolutely. When you get stuck in these small seminars with a half a dozen people and 5 of them were smoking and I wasn't, so other things like that have surely come a long way.
Another major factor in 1971, spring 1971, the personnel director sent a letter to all of the women's staff in all of the offices, not faculty, but other women's staff, saying they would not be allowed to wear pants. Well, the women felt quite helpless. If they complained, then their jobs and tension would be created in the office. And so that's where we had learned that women had to stick together. Within the black movement, they had to stick together. We had learned from that model. And so faculty women wrote the letter of protest and asked to see the personnel director in person to discuss the policy. And he immediately rescinded his decree. And so we forget those amazing changes.
Incidentally, you'll remember very well that there were asterisks in the faculty directory indicating who was married.
Yes,
Really?
and you had to make sure when you got divorced that you got that asterisk out of there.
Right.
Taking off on that idea, Tom, you mentioned that in your department now it's almost exclusively women students that are coming into ComDis.
Pretty much journalism, too.
And is that true?
Oh, yes, heavy percentage females.
Carol and Margaret have done a lot of work on gender issues. Let's talk about this for just a few minutes. Where would you like us to go over the next few years at UW-Eau Claire in confronting this issue of gender differences and the way men and women are treated differently at the university?
Well, I think one thing we have to look at, which some people obviously have started to do, is gender balancing the curriculum in terms of what they teach in their classes. I mean, women are half the population, and yet in many fields, we're just beginning to learn about women and what their roles and contributions have been. And, you know, women's history, and I teach a sociology of gender class. Yeah. But I think where we're at right now is we're still at the point of having separate classes that are seen as women's classes or gender classes, as opposed to dealing with issues for women and men where relevant throughout all classes. So, I mean, I think the curriculum is a really important place. I mean, if you're teaching a class where there should be things on women as well as men, and that's not being taught, what message are you giving your students, women and men, that women don't really matter? And the women students are hearing that, and the men students are hearing that. And so I think it can have a tremendous impact. And it's sort of, we talked earlier in another panel about the kind of ghettoization that can take place with information on women. And in the sense that it's all, as I say, separated into separate classes or a little segment of a class or something like that, and that's not true integration. So I think the curriculum is an important area.
In 1992, we look back 20 years and we say, there weren't any women in military schools. There were 1 or 2 women in law school classes, 1 or 2 women in medical school classes. I hope in 2022 that students, college students, will look back and say, oh, that's weird. In 1992, there were only 1 or 2 men in images of women in literature. There were only 1 or 2 men in women in sociology classes. Then we'll know society has changed. But it hasn't. Since we started teaching the first women's studies course in 1971, we have 1 or 2 men, maybe 3 or 4 at the most, in the women's courses, which means there's something wrong with those courses at this point.
Will women's studies still exist in 2050?
I hope so. Just,
as
I hope
a
African American literature
Will there be men's
studies.
studies then too?
We have the study of men throughout a lot of our history. I mean, if you look at what we have covered, and there is actually an emerging field of men's studies, which at least part of the field is re-examining men's roles. It's not simply reiterating traditional roles, but so there already has been some of that.
I'm probably the only department represented here where the textbooks for 20 years, when there's a pronoun used, it's she or her. And so I guess I look at it from the minority viewpoint nowadays. And no, I agree with what you're saying. I would like to think that in 2050 there would be back to the more even balance between male and female. I guess part of what concerns me, especially maybe as a product of the 80s, now that we're in the enlightened 90s, is that the idea of men being nurturing or being caring or being concerned or being healers is kind of dropping away. We almost see 2 things going on at once. We see the role of women being enhanced, but if you think back on the 80s, it really became much more in to go to business school or to law school perhaps than to medical school or to be a teacher or to be a social worker. And again, being maybe a product of the caring 60s, I think back to that time when social concern or concern for earth, environment, whatever was maybe kind of more generalized among men and women. So I would like to see more men in our field.
Statistics point to that. I mean,
and I would,
when you get the business people to interview, I think they'll tell them they're declining
enrollment. Backing
enrollment.
off from kind of the rush to power or the rush to income, perhaps, that the 80s engendered. I'm not saying that it just existed in the 80s, but I'd like to see a balancing of the two.
More
It's
service
been
to others?
acceptable.
Excuse
More
me?
service to others?
Yeah, yeah. I think rather than simply profit motive, more kind of the service motive.
Henry, you said the preponderance of students now in journalism are women?
That's correct.
That's a tremendous reversal.
Oh, yes, it's a big reversal over the last 25, 30 years.
What's happening?
Well, it relates to some of this. Previously, there were very few role models for women. Now women are seen doing the news, or seen on the air. They're seen as newspaper reporters, although women did have a role in newspapers for quite a long time, but they weren't as visible. And so when you see people doing these things, you can attempt to emulate them. And also, of course, I think that some women perhaps have paid closer attention to grammar and spelling and whatnot coming up, and can just do better. I'll just say frankly, overall, the women do better in our classes than men.
Are you finding that reflected in the job placement then as well? For your women grads, are they doing as well as the men grads were doing 20 and 25 years ago?
That is a slow change. But now we do have women who are news directors, executive producers. That's the ultimate test, whether who's going to be boss.
Okay.
And so it was one thing in the 70s and 80s to begin getting more women into the field. Now we have to see who's going to be, whether the boss role is going to be shared equally. And that's only emerging. That's only emerging. The numbers have not been reflected. I mean, to say there's a preponderance of women, that then there's a preponderance of women executives. No, that hasn't happened
Still
yet.
a really small proportion.
Yes.
The occupations are still really highly gender segregated. You know, women and men are still tending to go into different fields and different occupations. If you look at the percentage of women in those top, corporate level jobs, they're still pretty small numbers.
And in television, we haven't figured out anything about aging. Aging is still an unanswered question, because these women came in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and are they going to be kept on? You might say that's an actual issue that's discussed. What will happen, especially as anchor women.
Because of the emphasis on attractiveness for
Attractiveness,
females,
right, and youth.
men get distinguished. I mean, we have a lot of older men who are in those roles.
That's correct.
Yeah.
So that's an unanswered question.
Henry, in your opening comments, you reflected that students today, compared to 20 years ago, are much more vocationally driven. They're worried, they're concerned about finding a job. They're looking at this university perhaps as a union card, or as a key to get that first job. Currently,
right.
at the UW-Eau Claire, there is an initiative called the redefinition of the baccalaureate degree. And it perhaps is an effort to humanize, with a small h, and diversify, and at the same time bring in different disciplines to communicate and interact with each other, to provide a more integrated curriculum perhaps, to maybe fulfill more the traditional role that the liberal arts institution did. And part of the discussion about that was brought up in an earlier conversation was that the redefinition of the baccalaureate degree may, in effect, be more effective in creating the fully rounded individual, a person who is truly educated for life as opposed to being trained for a vocation. But that may require that students are obligated to take more courses, that it would take them longer to graduate, or that they would be off of the track that they have chosen. So you have a bit of a dichotomy here. And I'm wondering if first of all, if you see that same problem inherent in the redefinition of the baccalaureate degree, and if you do, how can we as an institution face up to that issue?
Well, to take it from the top, I don't necessarily recommend this idea of being vocationally oriented. But the students, it seems to me, and others can comment on it, seem to me to be driven partly by their parents and by the economic climate, and that jobs just aren't as plentiful. And so if you're going to get one, it's not just going to be there. Well, I think Tom can confirm this. In the 70s, the thought of the students out in the streets was not whether I'm going to get a job. There's going to be one. There'll be one. I don't have to worry about that. Now things are just a tad different. And so there is that kind of emphasis. No, I'd agree that we need a broader-based liberal arts education. Oh, yes. But there still probably will have to be then some professional orientation at a later time, someplace it's going to have to come along. You don't want to, I don't even like the word training or vocational. Those don't seem to have the right ring for education or higher education. But it exists, and I observe it and see it in the part of our students.
Would you see that at the graduate level, perhaps, some of that training, or
Yes,
I'm
I
not
think that's what people
comfortable
are
with that
saying,
either,
especially in
but-
journalism, there's talk about that,
Yeah.
that you would concentrate on liberal arts as an undergraduate, and then you would go to a graduate program. People are saying that.
A few years ago, Wall Street Journal did a survey of 200 industries and business, asking them if they would prefer someone who was job trained or someone educated in the humanities. And I don't remember what the percentage was, but there was an astonishing interest in hiring the liberal arts graduate. And so I think maybe there is a trend that we'll see more and more
we do.
in the future.
It seems in U.S. education for the last 50 or 100 years in higher ed, we've really had the idea that you go to college to get a job. And that seems to be really quite different from the European model of higher ed and from how I think higher ed ought to operate. Again, back to my own field, I kind of cringe when I realize that in order for a person to get an undergraduate major in sort of the standard 4 years now, and really when you think about it, the 4-year college degree is a purely arbitrary amount of years. It doesn't have to be 4, but we've kind of come to that as a tradition, and so people come, I think, to this university and others with the expectation that they can get in and out at least with an initial degree in 4 years. But in reality, if someone probably doesn't start their coursework as a first semester freshman in communication disorders, they're going to get behind in the sequence, and therefore that 4-year undergrad degree becomes a 5 or at least a 4.5-year undergrad degree, and then a 2.5-year master's on top of that, and then a year of internship just to get your basic credential, and it makes it a very long hike. But I become very concerned when our students, again, just in our field, but I'm sure it happens in other fields too, they kind of just live and breathe communication disorders for the next 6-7 years, and they haven't had a chance to take a course in astronomy or in art history or in sociology. Not that they might not like to, but it's that, again, we kind of put them into this pipeline, and it isn't all our fault either. There's accrediting agencies and licensing agencies and so forth that we have to meet the requirements of in a reasonable time. So again, I guess for me, the crux of the argument has always come back to, I think we view higher education more as kind of time served or time put in for a degree rather than actual learning accomplished. And if I could make a change or a recommendation for now or for at any time in the future, is that I really think higher ed ought to be, and a person's progress through a higher ed program really should be more measured on what they've learned or achieved or attained rather than just how many semesters and how many credits have been attained. And I realize there are some incongruencies with that argument too, but I guess from the pure liberal arts sense, I think if we can catch people, or if we can set them aglow with a lifelong love for learning and wanting to learn more, even in a very clinical field where truly the outcome of what we do is to get a person a job, and the job market is excellent for all of our master's grads. But nonetheless, I think we stifle people by putting them into that type of a tightly locked curriculum. And I'm not sure if we've really educated them. We've trained them to do a profession.
Well, happily, our accrediting agency insists that 92 out of the 128 credits you need to graduate here at this time are in non-journalism skills related liberal arts, so they cannot overdose on skills.
I think sometimes, perhaps unintentionally, students get the message that general ed is something to get over with. I've heard that so many times. Well, I've almost got this over with, and maybe we reinforce that unintentionally. Well, have you taken care of your general education? And yet, general education, I mean, that's so much the crux of the liberal arts background, and so we may play a role unintentionally in that.
Tom, you made a comment that I would like to use as sort of a point of departure. You talked about sort of tongue-in-cheek being on the exile campus here. And as we sit here in this room and look up at McPhee, at the Athletic Center, and look over at the School of Nursing, and we know that we have a School of Education, the School of Business, as well as the Liberal Arts School, what do you think of the status of the intracollegiate discourse? You all had alluded to that in some degree earlier. And I'm wondering, how do you think we compare perhaps to other campuses What do you think might be some initiatives that could be taken to improve and enhance the discourse on campus? And where do you see that we might be ending up 10, 20 years from now in terms of improving the sense of community that this university is?
Mm-hmm. Well, again, just from a personal perspective, every time we have the wellness fair, which has been an excellent outreach in the last few years here, it happens over in Davies or Zorn, we have a booth that I operate dealing with vocal wellness, but invariably other faculty and even one of the other administrators, who shall remain unnamed, came over and asked how things were going in the speech department and wondered, how we were doing with folks in speech. And of course, it's not been speech for 20 years since before I was here. It is communication disorders, which is a totally separate department and a totally separate entity. Yeah. So I think there probably isn't as much awareness or sharing as we might like to think there is. Personally, I've had a chance to serve on some committees and do some research and so forth with folks around the campus where I think we've kind of made our own collegiality or our own sharing. But again, I think people get kind of in their own world. We end up talking our own language. We have our own terms that mean one thing to us in our own profession and something different to someone else. And perhaps that causes separation. A couple of times I've had efforts at interaction, at some collaborative research with folks in other departments actually thwarted by either generally that person's superior, where they said, well, you need to focus more time in your department. We can't have you strung all out on these different activities. So maybe we aren't quite walking the talk as well as we could on that. Again, just back to my own undergraduate experience at UW-Madison, I was part of the Integrated Liberal Studies program there, which I thought was excellent, where the literature professor taught about what the prevailing view of geography was at the time and how that affected trade, and everything was intertwined so that you didn't just think of geography as separate from English, as separate from composition. That type of integrational way of weaving together at least our general ed courses, and I would argue some of the more specific clinical or professional-based courses, I think there's some merit for that. As we redesign the baccalaureate degree, I think we can tie subjects or fields together so that we realize that, gosh, overall it's still the acquisition of knowledge or learning, whatever little compartment or department we might want to break it into. They all kind of meet in the middle and have a lot to contribute to each other.
And that won't be done until we get reduced teaching
Right,
hours.
I was just thinking about that.
Yes.
Because what I find, and I think one of Larry, you had said something about if you have a point to make, and I was thinking about this, and I find this faculty very hardworking. I mean, people are teaching heavy loads, they're trying to do research, many people, or some sort of scholarship. There's a heavy service component for many, many people, and I think what happens is not only our specialization keeps us apart, frankly, we don't have very much time. Yeah. I barely have time to have a whole lot of interaction sometimes with my own department members or the people on my own floor because, I'm just trying to keep up and I'm never ahead. I'm not even kept up usually. And that's, with working typically at least 6 days a week, maybe 7 sometimes. And so I think that people are working very, very hard. And with the kind of teaching load we have, it's hard to do all these other kinds of things. So something's got to give somewhere, and it affects, I think, the potential quality of student-faculty interaction. When we've got, class sizes of 75 people or more, we're carrying 150, 175 folks in a semester, and it's, for example, for me, it's very important to get to know my students, and I learn everybody's name. I can at least pass their tests back to them, but I don't get to know them very well, and yet that's, I think, what this university has been based on a lot is the whole idea of student-faculty interaction. We'd like to see more student-faculty research. Again, where do we find the time? We just, I think that's clear.
Here in the 90s, and I'm sure prior to this, but the phrase is out of Hyde. So in 2050, remember that phrase, out of Hyde, that all of this comes out of Hyde when we try to do it. And in case that phrase loses popularity, we'll resurrect it here.
And to remember something that Tom was alluding to that we call turf protection. So the different departments and the different schools still seem to protect their turf, and to have cross listings or to have joint majors and so on becomes difficult. Now, it was accomplished in the women's studies program.
It took us 20 years, though, to get
20 years,
an
yeah.
introduction to women's studies course.
Yeah.
This is a video time capsule, and now I'm going to give you an opportunity to talk to the future, so to speak. It's 2050, and your audience is comprised of perhaps students, faculty, staff, community people. An opportunity for you to speak to them about your hopes, predictions if you have them, warnings. What would you like to say to 2 generations hence? And I think maybe I'll just take you in maybe reverse order from the opening
good.
comments.
All
And
right.
I'll give
Think quick then.
Henry can bad clean up.
All right.
And Tom, I'll let you lead off.
All right. Well, maybe the first thing to say is that I will make every effort to be sitting in the audience there with you and hopefully can interpret your questions. So see you in 75 years or so. I guess from a higher ed standpoint, one of the things, again, that I'd like to see is that people view, especially higher education, but hopefully all education, as something that you personally do, not something that's done to you. Not which university did you go to, but what type of learning did you pursue? What type of learning did you accomplish, maybe regardless of where it was. So this isn't just for UW-EC. I think that technology has and is going to considerably increase the availability, the ready availability of learning to a lot of people. And again, back to disability, a lot of the people that I work with and that I spend my days with are perhaps non-speaking, non-writing, non-telecommunicating folk who are still very much in there. Their personality, their intellect, their cognitive skills are very much there. So even now we're seeing emerging a whole culture of people who are linked electronically to each other through modems, through computers. I would trust that would increase. I'm aware of some very excellent education outreaches, for instance, the Mind Extension University out of Colorado, which allows people to be at home in their bed in a respirator and still work on an MBA degree by computer. That type of thing I really encourage. I think that the only limits to our learning or the limits to our campus is probably where we can beam electrons or fiber optic cable. So I guess that's the type of thing that I would like to see happening at that time. I hope we keep on that path. I would like to see higher education opened up to absolutely anyone, anywhere, even if you are a severely cerebral palsy, non-speaking Honduran or Inuit living in a very remote area. Because of the availability of technology, I would like to think that higher ed on virtually every subject would be available to people like that. And again, I would like to be consulting on that at this time, so trust that I will be.
Thank you. Good comments.
As I picture that audience 60 years from now, I'm well aware that we are minority, that audience is going to be made up of Hispanics, African Americans, or Asian Americans. And I just hope they aren't too resentful of how we have structured things in this country since the 17th century. And I urge them to avoid some of our errors of being self-centered, and that their humanism carries them through to new heights in higher education.
Thank you.
I'd like to pick up on actually something Tom was saying about technology, because I think that is going to be the wave of the future as it is already today. I hope that it is the very positive scenario that he has suggested with our abilities to reach out to all sorts of different people and provide opportunities for learning, because I think that is the way we're going to change our society, which I think we need a lot of change. I guess one concern I have is that technology might work in a different way, and I'm thinking specifically of the college environment. I keep imagining a future where I'm not needed at all anymore, you know, and although that may be the way it is, just a facilitator or just a voice in a head on a video, you know. I'm hoping that we won't get to the point that we don't need human contact, that human contact will still be something that we value and that we can share. And because I think that personal contact is very, very powerful. And so that's where I guess I'd like to see things going.
I don't think that'll happen. Can I jump in
Oh,
here? or
sure.
am I
Good.
out of turn? I don't think that will
You don't
happen.
think so?
I think it will enhance or augment what we currently do. I think look at any of the other technology that we use, from print to telephone, radio, television. I recall reading back when Daguerre, Henry probably knows more about this than I do, invented photography in a fairly readily available basis. The Paris newspaper had a headline that read that art is dead, because now you no longer needed to paint or draw, you simply would take a photograph. And obviously art isn't dead. We have photography, but it also enhances or augments what we can do with art. So I would like to think that we'll probably find some glitches in the system, but I think we'll probably end up being able to deliver education on a much wider and better basis than we currently do.
Well, yes, Margaret, perhaps by 2050 people will have discovered that while we have global communication, instantaneous global communication, the best way to teach would be to have the student sitting on one end of the log and you sitting on the other end of the log, so that we won't know that. I do know one thing I'm going to tell you very quickly, and that is Uniroyal Goodrich was a rubber tire company that was located in Eau Claire, and it was purchased by the Michelin Corporation from France, which decided it was its oldest plant, so they have to phase it out, and 1,358 people lost their jobs, and it will be closing about a month from now. Just to clarify that reference. One of the things in the 1990s that troubles me is that it seems too much of a value is placed on education, too much value is placed on wealth and money, and education frequently plays into its hands. The student asks, well, what can I make? What can I get? How will this pay out monetarily? And I wish that would not be the case in 2050, that knowledge, indeed wisdom, might be cherished, and that there would be a value placed on that apart from just economic gain.
Dr. Ernest Boyer reflected on that very point when he was here a number of weeks ago, that higher education has to maybe refocus on service, and perhaps students, faculty, and staff need to work in less of a competitive and more of a cooperative frame of reference. And I think, taking off on that, let's talk a little bit about the Design for Diversity, which is a system-wide initiative which has been in effect for the last couple of years. And UW-Eau Claire, as one of the key cluster campuses, certainly is part of that program. How would you like to see Design for Diversity implemented here at UW-Eau Claire, specifically in your department? And beyond that, how do you feel that the institution here as a whole can truly contribute to multicultural awareness and advancement, both economically and socially, for the minorities in the United States?
Well, I'll begin. I think it's easiest for me to respond to, because in the area of literature and through our writing courses, we've had significant component of the diversity courses since the late 60s. And the problem is that we don't see the students getting the spirit, that they frequently are moved by the literature, they're touched by it at the moment, but they don't seem to, and of course this is a terrible generalization, many of them don't seem to carry it into their daily lives. It goes back to the point I made earlier, that it's an intellectual exercise in many ways. And so there has to be more things going on in the university community and in the community at large, involving students in diversified situations with other cultures. It's just not enough to have the courses.
People need to have the contact with Hmong people. They need to learn something about their food. They need to learn something about Afro-American music. They need to go to a dance. Is that what you're saying? Is there needs to be that personal interaction?
And the service element that has been brought up again and again. There have to be connections made so that it's a real life experience as well as an academic experience. And that's where Eau Claire is at a distinct disadvantage with its low minority community. Although with the growing Hmong community, that's certainly improving.
And I think that's true for students and faculty, just because the small percentage of people of color, both as faculty or as students, and with faculty we've talked, I think, earlier about role models and how important that can be, and just having day-to-day contact with people who are diverse. And so I think that needs to be reflected in the student body as well as faculty.
I was on a panel once with Link Walker, who was a football coach here for quite a long time in the 60s, 70s, 80s. And the athletic teams have been able to attain some diversity.
That's true.
The athletic teams attained diversity. And he said, well, you don't just sit there and wait for diversity to happen. You have to go out and actively pursue it. And of course, I wish our department would do more. I wish I would do more to make things happen. They just don't happen by sitting around. It's like the equal opportunity programs that people say, well, yes, we're an equal opportunity employer, but nobody has come to apply. No minorities have come to apply. Well, they think they've done something, but they haven't. You have to go and find people. And perhaps we have to make some changes to communicate in a different way and to teach communications in a different way. And those are things we're going to have to work on hard, but it's not going to happen just by sitting around and discussing it.
I think one very positive area that the campus has worked in, and certain people on campus notably, is I think the growing awareness and kind of legitimization of Native American culture with the recent powwows that were held here, with some of the coursework that's now offered with some of the faculty on board. I think maybe thinking of diversity from here north, I think we are doing at least better than we used to do, and in some ways maybe very well in terms of affirming and recognizing the culture and the background of Native Americans.
But we'd have to do more in that area, Tom, to just actually get some live bodies in the classroom.
We don't have very many, that's right.
We need scholarships.
One other thing is, again, back to a kind of a clinical field that I would like to see happen, and I hope by 2050 this has happened, is when we think about healthcare statistics, or when we think about incidence figures of cleft palate or stroke or laryngectomy or laryngeal cancer or any of the things that we deal with, all of our mindset is always, if not American, at least North American, U.S. and Canada. It really isn't third world. And truly the incidence of cerebral palsy and of just about any type of disabling condition, not necessarily always life-threatening, but devastatingly disabling, is vastly higher in third world countries. And so part of what I try to do in my own coursework, and I'd like to do a lot better at it, is get my students aware of and keep myself aware of the fact that really we're not just talking about the incidence of these disorders in our nice kind of squeaky clean Midwest environment. Really we're looking or trying to find out more and look at it from a worldwide or global perspective. And frankly, there isn't data. The World Health Organization just doesn't know how many CP kids there are in Africa or in the rural parts of South America, and et cetera, and yet they're just as deserving of the type of rehabilitation or medical services as any of our North American kind of homogeneous folk.
Tom mentioned something, Eric, and that is the university in the 80s and 90s has attempted to internationalize. Of course, we haven't totally succeeded in that either, but there has been this strong effort to reach out, to internationalize the classes, to make people aware of the global situation as Tom just described. More work to be done, but maybe by 2050 that will have been accomplished.
One thing I'd like to see by 2050, and hopefully a lot sooner if possible, we do need some different method of providing health care and funding health care, especially, again, in the case of long-term devastating disability. As things stand now, whether it's mainstream American families or minority families, the incidence or the occurrence of a disability, either from a child at birth or someone during their life, literally wipes out the family financially and prohibits someone from even participating in higher education. I was just reading shortly ago that really overall in the U.S. as of today, only 17% of the population have a four-year undergraduate type of college education, and about 6% have a graduate degree of some sort. So even though kind of living in our environment, we think that everybody goes to college and everybody gets a degree, that really is not so. And when you imagine the economic clout of someone who probably hasn't had the advantage of higher ed, and there's back to the idea of getting the job and having economic power because of completing higher education. But it is true, let's face it, it does enhance one's earning capability. But if you assume that about 3/4 of folk, at least in our country, and probably more so in other countries, haven't had access to that, and then when faced with devastating long-term health care costs, if anything, that just removes you more from the picture of ever becoming economically viable by being able to afford education. So I hope somewhere all of that shakes out, and I'm not just sure how or just when, but I would like to discuss that with you all, have that resolved at that time.
Can I say one more thing?
Please.
You laugh.
I think, too, for the future, what I would like to see goes back to a comment I made earlier about gender balancing the curriculum, and I think we need to be very conscious of gender, race, class, ethnicity issues, and again, throughout the curriculum. I think that that's a real critical area. And certainly there are already people who are doing those kinds of things, but from my sense in talking with people and some of my own experiences, sometimes that's not an easy thing to do because of the homogeneity of our student body and trying to get them to think in new ways and consider other groups and things like that. And I think we may meet with some intolerance sometimes. And so how do we best deal with that, the intolerance, and how do we get to a point of being more open and accepting of different ideas?
Any other summary comments? We've got a few minutes left here. We're at about, actually we're coming to the end of an hour here. So this is it. This is your chance, again, speaking to the future, or
Just purely on the lighter side, just to show you where things have changed in 20 years since I was an undergrad or grad student. I was coming out of class about a year ago and happened to be walking by a group of students sitting on the floor over in our building there. And I just overheard one young lady saying to another something about, did you know that Paul McCartney was in a band before he was in Wings? And for those of you who may not be acquainted, Paul McCartney was one of the founders of the Beatles. And that was her honest comment. She wasn't kidding or anything. She said, did you know that he was in a band before he was in Wings? And I thought, whoa, things have changed. And then the other thing that happened was I actually got laughed at in class a while ago because I had mentioned how when I was in school and in grad school, we had the big old Monroe calculators. Remember those adding machines, and you had to crank the handle. We didn't have the hand calculators, and everybody laughed thinking I was joking that, that I went to school so long ago that we didn't have the hand calculators. And it's true. That's exactly what we did. We didn't have the electronic. We had the old mechanical Monroes. So I'm sure that by the time this is viewed, what we have talked about or concerns we've shared will probably be as passé as the Beatles and the Monroe calculator. And it's hard to project just what you will find humorous about what we're saying.
I agree.
I'm sure many of the concerns and goals will also be the same. And it's been very interesting hearing you all interact and express very well many of your ideas about the university here this afternoon. Henry Lippold, Margaret Cassidy, Carol Fairbanks,
Thank you.
and Tom King, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good discussion.